The commission will come to order, and I apologize first at the outset for the delay. We did have a series of votes on the floor of the House, so precluded Mr. Turner and I and other members from being here, but thank you for your patience, and welcome to everyone. Today we will review the aspirations and the preparedness of Bosnia, Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Kosovo to join or deepen engagement with the NATO alliance, an important step for us and for them, and quite timely in the run-up to the next NATO summit, which will take place in Chicago on May 20th to 21st. In the past, I and many other Commission members, including chairman and co-chairman, have been very strong supporters of NATO enlargement. It has been a very good thing for all, for our country, and for the new democracies in East Central Europe that have joined the alliance since 1998. Not only did enlargement stabilize Central Europe, but countries that formerly threatened us with militaries were integrated into the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact, have now become some of our closest and most trusted allies. They have shouldered real responsibilities, and some of their soldiers have paid the ultimate sacrifice in defending liberty, particularly in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Today, I believe further NATO enlargement can do likewise, stabilize the Western Balkans and provide our country with responsible allies. Yet, of course, countries that seek to join NATO have to meet military standards and human rights standards. In these respects, Bosnia, Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Kosovo will have different challenges, and they will probably not be ready to join the alliance all at the same time, although they are all proceeding in that direction. In respect of human rights, many countries of the Western Balkans have made great progress in combating human trafficking, especially given the blatant and widespread trafficking of young women into the sex trade the region experienced just a decade ago. In 2011, Bosnia and Macedonia joined NATO member Croatia on Tier 1 in the State Department's report on trafficking in persons. Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia are at Tier 2, as is NATO member Albania. As the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which mandates the tier rankings, I want to strongly urge all of these countries to take the action necessary to reach Tier 1 this year. Nothing less should be expected from friends and possible NATO allies than to protect people from being sold into modern-day slavery. Other issues before the alliance, Afghanistan, missile defense, Libya, the Eurozone crisis, should not cause us to forget the long-term imperative of bringing the countries of the Western Balkans into NATO. American soldiers have done duty there, including members of my own family, in Bosnia as well as in Kosovo, and we don't want that to happen again, of course. The issue of stability remains, and NATO membership is key to the solution. This means we have to encourage their NATO aspirations and move their applications forward as quickly as humanly possible. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Turner, for any comments he might have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing and certainly picking this as a topic. Both the issue of the enlargement of NATO and, of course, the issue of the Balkans are very important. As we all know that the enlargement of NATO has been seen as a pathway for ensuring the democratization of Eastern Europe, a pathway to EU, and, of course, for a pathway for the strengthening of ties with the United States. Looking at this issue with respect to the Balkans, I think, is very important and is a topic that I think at times gets neglected. As we look back from the 90s when the United States and our NATO allies joined together in trying to establish peace that was embodied in the Dayton Peace Accords, a treaty that was negotiated in my home community of Dayton, Ohio. We certainly have seen stability and peace, but still, I think, difficulty in how to transition the area to some permanency, both in Bosnia and its ungovernable constitutional structure, and certainly the issues of Kosovo and Macedonia. I appreciate you taking the focus. I also want to make a particular thank you to Ivan and the German Marshall Fund for your focus on the issue of Bosnia. You'll be participating in a forum in Dayton, Ohio on this particular issue in the beginning part of February with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and trying to, of course, leverage off of what you're doing here today, Chairman, for looking at ways in which we can ensure that this area can transition and that NATO can be an important instrument in that. So thank you for including me.
I just note for the audience that Mr. Turner, or Chairman Turner, is the head of our delegation to the U.S. To the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and does wonderful work there. And I want to thank him for his leadership on that very, very important assembly. Because we, with our Parliamentary Assembly for OSCE, know how important it is that the delegations meet, discuss, and it's not just executive branch, it is legislative branch as well, and Mr. Turner heads that delegation. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Daniel Serwer, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations and professor at the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. In the 1990s, Dr. Serwer served in the State Department as U.S. Special Envoy and Coordinator for the Bosnian Federation. In the late 1990s and until recently, he also served at the U.S. Institute for Peace, encouraging the U.S. government to promote democracy in Serbia rather than rely on Slobodan Milosevic to keep his word as a Dayton signatory. The Helsinki Commission is pleased to have him return at a hearing as a hearing witness, and especially today for his willingness to participate through Skype from Belgrade at a late hour and after a very long flight. I would note parenthetically that in the 1999, I authored a bill that passed the House called the Serbia Democracy Act, and one of the men who really helped us craft that legislation was Dr. Serwer, and I want to thank him for that. It unfortunately failed in the Senate. It was blocked from even coming to a vote, but it nevertheless articulated what the House really believed ought to happen in Serbia, and he helped us write it. Our second witness is Nida Gelazis, a senior associate of the European Studies program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she directs the working group on the Western Balkans. From 1994 to 1996, she served as managing editor of the journal The East European Constitutional Review, and in 2009 co-edited Cities After the Fall of Communism, Reshaping Cultural Landscapes and the European Identity. Ms. Gelazis has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Chicago and a master's in comparative European international law from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Our third witness is Ivan Vejvoda, a vice president at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He previously served as executive director of the German Marshall Fund's Balkan Trust for Democracy, dedicated to strengthening democratic institutions in southeastern Europe. Prior to joining the GMF staff, Mr. Vejvoda was a senior advisor on foreign policy and European integration to Serbian Prime Minister Djindjic, who was assassinated in 2003, and his successor, Zoran Živković, in the 1990s. He was among the ranks of the democratic opposition to Milosevic. He holds a diploma from the Institute of Political Studies in Paris. Dr. Serwer, if you could begin your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you on a subject close to both my heart and brain, NATO and the Western Balkans. NATO entered the Balkans in 1993 with the no-fly zone over Bosnia. It was an important moment. Until then, Yugoslavia had been considered outside the NATO area, a concept that lost relevance as the alliance moved from thinking of itself as a defensive pact against the Soviet Union to an alliance protecting European and American security from risks anywhere in the world. 2 decades later, the Western Balkans are entering NATO. Slovenia, Croatia, and Albania have already made the strategic choice of aligning their defense efforts with the alliance. They also contribute to alliance efforts in Afghanistan and Kosovo, taking on burdens at least proportional to their size and economic weight. They enable us to devote American personnel to other priority missions, both NATO and non-NATO. Slovenia, Croatia, and Albania have also benefited from their efforts to reform their security services, professionalize them, and reorganize them to meet NATO standards. These are countries that have made a profound commitment to democratic norms, even if they still sometimes struggle to meet them. 5 more countries of the Western Balkans remain outside NATO today. It is time to allow 2 of them to begin to enter, Macedonia and Montenegro. Macedonia has done yeoman's work completing its membership action plan. Just 10 years ago, ethnic war wrecked the country. The conflict ended with an agreement to reform its state institutions, including the security services. The Macedonians took the advantage of the opportunity to professionalize their security services to meet NATO standards. I spoke Friday with Brigadier General William Roy, whose Vermont National Guard Brigade deployed for 6 months in 2010 to Afghanistan with Macedonian troops integrated. He reports in an email, by all accounts, they performed their mission to the desired standard. They were involved in a number of tactical engagements with enemy forces while integrated with my companies. Most impressive has been the development of their NCO Corps, the Non-Commissioned Officer Corps, a key to having a well-trained and disciplined force. While I might wish that Skopje would spend less money on tributes to Alexander the Great, the only thing keeping Macedonia from NATO membership today is the dispute with Greece over the country's name, which prevented it from receiving an invitation at the Bucharest summit in 2008. Since then, the International Court of Justice has found that Greece violated its interim accord with the government in Skopje when it blocked membership at Bucharest. May is the time to correct this injustice. Chicago is the place. The NATO summit should issue an invitation for membership to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or to Macedonia by whatever name Skopje and Athens may agree upon before that. The United States should make it clear to Greece that repeating the mistake of Bucharest is not acceptable, as the ICJ has already said. Mr. Chairman, with the door open to NATO open at Chicago, I would also urge that Montenegro be given a clear signal that it too will get an invitation once it completes its membership action plan. We should not close the door to a country that has been willing to join us in Afghanistan and contributes to UN operations in Somalia and Liberia. 3 more Western countries would still remain then outside NATO: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Kosovo. None is ready for an invitation. Bosnia has failed to meet the international community requirement that it resolve defense property issues. It should get that done before Chicago so it can embark on the membership process. Kosovo, which will want to join NATO as quickly as possible, is just beginning to think about the nature and scope of its future security forces. The United States should help Kosovo establish forces that can meet its legitimate security interests within the NATO context, enabling the eventual withdrawal of NATO's Kosovo force. Serbia has not indicated it wishes to join NATO due to popular distaste for an alliance that bombed the country in 1999 and played a crucial role in removing Kosovo from Milosevic regime oppression. Nevertheless, Serbia has participated in Partnership for Peace and has deployed troops to Afghanistan. The NATO door should stay open. The choice of joining or not should be Belgrade's. The odds of Belgrade joining NATO would be significantly increased if Macedonia and especially Montenegro were to make clear progress toward membership in Chicago. NATO members would then eventually surround Serbia, making the decision to join geographically and strategically compelling. With a decision to join NATO, Belgrade would have to make other difficult decisions about both Bosnia and Kosovo. Good neighborly relations are a prerequisite for NATO, as they are for the EU. But EU membership is still far off. Serbia could, if it wanted, join NATO much faster, but it will need to demonstrate unequivocally respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all its neighbors. Mr. Chairman, NATO membership is not a panacea. I do not believe allowing Bosnia early entry, as some advocate, would be wise. But real progress on membership for Macedonia and Montenegro at Chicago would impart a sense of momentum to the Western Balkans that's lacking today. With Europe immersed in a financial crisis, only Croatia can hope for EU membership within the next few years. The others will have to wait until Europe has its financial house in order. Many current members have found NATO provides relief from the historic baggage of past wars, ethnic conflicts, and mass atrocities. It's a good idea to extend an invitation to Macedonia at Chicago and make welcoming noises to Montenegro. Joining an alliance to make the world safer for democratic societies is a noble cause. The door should remain open for others to enter when they are ready and willing. NATO expansion into the Balkans serves U.S. interests not only in that region, but wherever NATO or U.S. forces deploy in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so very much, Doctor. And we've been joined by Robert Adderholt, a member of the Commission. Any opening comments, Robert?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be here and look forward to hearing the testimony this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. We've also been joined by Elliot Engel, who is a senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and a man who was tenacious on issues relative to Kosovo and human rights there. I'd like to yield any time he would like to take.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me personally thank you for the wonderful work that you have always done for so many years. I've been in Congress now for 23. You came before me, and even when I came, your name was out there as someone who always stood up for what he believed was right. And I think we got to have more people who do that. So thank you for your work, and thank you for the opportunity to sit on the dais here at today's very important hearing. I'm not a member of the Commission, but I do appreciate the welcome the Commission has shown me, with you in particular, through the years. As you know, and you mentioned it, Mr. Chairman, I've long taken an interest in the Western Balkans. I have an interest in expanding NATO into the Western Balkans, and this has been a passion of mine ever since the former Yugoslavia broke up. In 2003, the House passed my resolution commending the U.S. Adriatic Charter, which set the stage for Albania, Croatia, and Macedonia to join NATO. And as we all know today, there's still work to do as several countries remain outside of NATO. Until Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and even Serbia enter NATO, as their fellow Balkan countries already have, our job is not done, although I have taken a particular interest in Kosovo, and I'm anxious for Serbia or other countries not to block Kosovo from entering the European Union as they are doing in the United Nations. I think that's counterproductive. All of the Balkan countries need to enter all of the Euro-Atlantic structures, not only NATO but the EU as well. And again, I have no objection to Serbia going into the EU as long as Kosovo goes into the EU at the same time, so Serbia cannot block Kosovo. I would just briefly like to talk about one key issue facing Kosovo, and that's the future of KFOR, the NATO Kosovo force. I'm a strong supporter of KFOR's continued presence in Kosovo. I reject any talk of KFOR leaving, and until we're sure that the security situation is resolved in Kosovo, I believe that we should not remove additional forces. I believe that bond steel should stay open and that we should not pull back. I realize there's been a slow drawdown in national contingents in Kosovo, but I think the recent blockades and other events in northern Kosovo have shown the world that now is not the time for countries to remove additional forces from Kosovo. In fact, I believe that as our country removes forces from Iraq and the rest of Europe, this is a very good time to shift to, by a moderate amount, a few battalions or so to the U.S. contingent in Kosovo. We've got a good base at Camp Bondsteel. I was just there 2 months ago with ample space for our troops, and the Kosovars want us to stay, so I think the choice is simple. And I want to just state very simply, we're not talking thousands and thousands of troops just over 1,000 to guarantee the peace and to ensure that our worthy investment in Kosovo is not in vain. I can hardly think of a place in the world which is more pro-U.S. Than the people of Kosovo. So it would be a pity if, just to save a few dollars, we're not present when this region needs us the most. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back, and I'm interested, obviously, in hearing what the distinguished witnesses have to say.
Thank you so much, Mr. Engel. I'd like to now yield to our second witness, Ms. Gelazis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Helsinki Commission. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on NATO and the Western Balkans. I'll base my testimony on some of the conclusions from working group meetings organized at the Wilson Center, which aimed at finding common ground on European and American perspectives on the region's Euro-Atlantic integration. These discussions were based on three premises. First, that peace and stability in the Western Balkans can only be achieved by shifting domestic politics away from ethno-nationalist ambitions and toward building open and democratic institutions that serve the interests of all citizens and will allow the country to actively participate in European institutions. Second, the process of becoming a member of the European Union and NATO is itself transformative, and that transformation can end abruptly once a country achieves membership. Third, given the region's legacy of conflict, it will be more difficult for the Western Balkans to meet the accession criteria for NATO and the EU than it was during previous enlargements. Working from these premises, it's important to recognize that the European Union's enlargement process has a much stronger transformative power than NATO enlargement. NATO's norms focus squarely on military issues, which are relatively easier to implement given the natural hierarchy within defense institutions. Therefore, though NATO requires that all candidates are democracies, it relies on outside standards and actors to measure and evaluate democratic consolidation. As in previous enlargements, ensuring that state institutions are effective and democratic is driven by the EU. Therefore, NATO enlargement is not a replacement for EU enlargement. It is essential, rather, that the United States continue to actively support not only NATO, but also EU enlargement, as well as the countries in the Western Balkans, to help them achieve the goal of Euro-Atlantic integration. The distinction between the transformative impact of EU and NATO is made clear by the difference between the two countries that became NATO members in 2009, Croatia and Albania. Both countries met the criteria for NATO accession, and today they have active troops participating in the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. But where the Croatian government continued to adopt political and economic reforms that were necessary for EU accession, Albania's progress has been stalled by a political impasse, allegations of government corruption, and election irregularities. The transformation in the former meant that Croatia was invited to join the EU last year, while the Council postponed offering Albania candidate status. It's important to keep this limited capacity in mind as we move forward. NATO membership may soon be granted to several countries that have met or are working to meet the criteria, but we should be aware that those reforms are limited compared to the transformation that the EU requires. Moreover, once countries become members, the opportunity to resolve internal and external problems diminishes substantially. Indeed, NATO and the EU have run into the same problems in many of the countries in the region. And since NATO has fewer tools at its disposal, the EU is seen as the leader in transforming the region, especially when it comes to bilateral issues. The events of the last few months highlight the problems facing the international community. In Kosovo, NATO returned to its former role as the first responder after barricades were erected in the north. Although NATO had planned to further reduce its troops in Kosovo by the end of 2011, this reduction was postponed due to the violence that broke out. The violent reaction to protests by Kosovar police that took place last weekend does not inspire confidence that local police will be able to take over from NATO anytime soon. Meanwhile, the EU-led delegations between Pristina and Belgrade have been slow but relatively fruitful, especially since the EU has the power to bring Serbia to the table with a carrot of candidate status. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, it took 14 months to form a government, which stalled the progress towards meeting the final requirement for activating the membership action plan. During this period, NATO officers could do little aside from conducting an audit of the defense property. It remains to be seen how long it will take for the entities to muster the political will to transfer state and defense property to the government. Even if this is done relatively quickly, the country's constitution, as well as the continued presence of the Office of the High Representative, challenge its democratic credentials. NATO enlargement, therefore, cannot replace EU enlargement, but both must be elements of a larger, coordinated policy between the American and European partners. Another observation of the working group is that because integration into European institutions is an elite-driven process, it is left to politicians in the region to explain the accession process to their constituents. In some cases, politicians have created narratives in which conditionality is seen as blackmail, or that meeting conditions undermines national interests. This is most notably the case in Macedonia, where Greece is blamed for the lack of progress in both EU and NATO accession. The fact that the International Court of Justice recently ruled in Macedonia's favor would seem to be further evidence to support the claim. However, the European Commission's recent progress report identifies a series of worrisome political trends in the country, which require us to question whether the country is moving in the direction of building a consolidated democracy. Albania's admission to NATO might serve as an example here. If the United States wants to see effective democratic institutions and an effective cooperation between ethnic groups in Macedonia, there may be good reason to wait for an agreement with Greece, since an agreement would offer evidence that Macedonia's leaders have put their undemocratic ethno-nationalist aims behind them. At the same time, the United States ought to put more pressure on Greece to participate in finding a workable solution. In Serbia, the process of European integration is broadly seen as trading national interests for economic development. The public is understandably even less sympathetic towards NATO. It is therefore important for the United States and its partners to engage with civil society organizations in Serbia and throughout the region as a way to offer a different narrative about the EU and NATO accession processes, and in order to support local NGOs that are making demands on their governments which are in line with EU and NATO conditions. Direct communication with civil society will help to maintain support for reforms, even with a protracted accession process. Direct engagement with the public will also diminish another problem that was identified by the working group, that the primacy of the EU and NATO accession policy is seen as evidence that America is pulling out from the region. Therefore, the U.S., should be more visible in public debates about Euro-Atlantic integration. We ought to show that the EU and NATO integration are linked and that we are putting our weight behind this process. Our involvement with civil society should aim at increasing the authenticity of international conditions, showing that the conditions are legitimate and necessary, and that they do not compete with national interests. With the cooperation of our partners in Europe, we can work on developing policies similar to the successful visa liberalization strategy, which combine conditions with clear and immediate rewards. We might consider what more could be done through the Adriatic Charter or the National Guard State Partnership Program to create additional engagement between the United States and the countries of the region. Adding additional programs will reinforce the message that the transformative process of the integration is the prize, not just membership. Thank you very much.
For your testimony. Mr. Vejvoda.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership of this commission and keeping the Balkans on the agenda of the commission and of the international agenda. Given the burning issues elsewhere in the world and given the progressive stabilization and reinforcement of peace in the region, it is easy to forget that we have not come to harbor yet, and thus efforts by both the United States and the European Union are required to help this region achieve its ultimate goal of full peace and stability in a Europe whole, free, and at peace and democratic. So it is most timely that with the approaching NATO summit in Chicago, you are addressing these issues. Let me just for a moment go to the wider Balkans, if I can put it, and remind ourselves that the story of NATO begins with the accession of Greece and Turkey in 1952, and then with a long gap of the Cold War, the accession of Romania and Bulgaria in 2004 has been very important. Important in the sense that it has encircled positively the region that we're talking about, the Western Balkans. And I call this region the inner courtyard of both the European Union and NATO. And that in itself, I think, has been a stabilizing factor. The fact that Albania and Croatia have joined recently at the Strasbourg-Kale Summit in 2009 has been very significant for this final part of integration. I would like to remind us that Croatia in 4 days' time is voting in a referendum on its accession to the European Union. This will be an extremely important signal to all the countries of this region that the merit-based approach on democratic and market reforms, if accomplished, is rewarded by joining these institutions. And that in itself is very significant both for NATO enlargement, because there is a system of communicating vessels here. This is a tightly knit region that used to most of its part form the part of former Yugoslavia. There are strong bonds irrespective of what happened in the 90s, and there is an effect of the Joneses. What the Joneses do is also followed by the other neighbors, and so Croatia, being the locomotive of this mini train moving forward, has a pulling effect. And I would submit to you, Mr. Chairman, that the fact that Bosnia has managed to put a government together just a few weeks ago is the result, in fact, of this accession process moving forward, and of Serbia possibly getting candidacy to the European Union in March. And so it's very important, as we discuss the individual countries, to look at how the region is progressing as a whole, and I will come back to that a little later. I would also like to mention that it is important to look at the relations between the European Union and NATO itself, and I think much can be done to advocate a closening of the gap between these two organizations, even though there are contexts. The fact that Turkey does not recognize Cyprus is an impeding element in the closer relations and the closer joint activities of these two paramount organizations. But Euro-Atlantic integration also means the steady integration into other institutions that we mentioned less, and I would like to applaud the entry of Montenegro into the World Trade Organization in December. Serbia has not yet achieved that, Kosovo neither, and I think that we have to look at those other parts of that broader Euro-Atlantic framework, of which, of course, NATO and the EU are the spine. I would like to mention, along with my colleagues, the importance of civil society in these activities. The fact that we have a number of think tanks and NGOs, not only the Atlantic Councils or the Atlantic Associations that are endeavoring to pursue this effort, has been important for helping these countries move forward. The diversity of relations that exist regionally between the NGOs, I think, has spurred on also the state, military, security, and other institutional levels. And in this regard, the Regional Cooperation Council, based in Sarajevo, has done, in particular in the past 2 years, very much to bring these institutions together. Most notably, again, over the past 2 months, the intelligence chiefs of the militaries of the region have met. The defense ministers meet regularly within their cooperation process. And at NATO Brussels, the Southeast European countries have their organizations, which in fact will be chaired by Serbia's head of delegation during the year 2012. This is maybe the granular view, but I think it's important when we consider how the movement, often slow and sometimes frustrating for those of us who are from the region, nonetheless advances. And thus, if we look back to 2000, the year of the demise of the Milosevic regime through a peaceful electoral change, and we look where we are today in January 2012, we see this progressive chart that we have witnessed over the years, in spite of the slides, ebbs and flows in some of these developments. That is to say that the positive incitement to, again, on a merit-based approach, advance these countries is extremely important. And thus I would concur with my esteemed colleagues that to pursue NATO's membership in NATO, possibly already at the Chicago summit, would be very important. The fact that Macedonia didn't become a member in 2009 was detrimental to the process of further stabilization of the region. It would have been a very strong signal to the country itself, but to the rest of us who are in that region. Montenegro also has made significant advances, and I would also project that now that Bosnia has a government, or will have it in a few weeks' time, will also move to the resolution of the property issue that has been a major obstacle to the implementation of the membership action plan. And thus this progressive movement indicates the political willingness of the region to move forward. Serbia, of course, is an outlier, as Dan Serwer said, because of the history of the conflict between NATO and Serbia, then called the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Nonetheless, even though this state of neutrality that was voted in by the Serbian parliament in 2006 has said for the moment no to membership, on all other fronts there has been significant advance, especially with the individual plan of Serbia moving forward, and of course of the full mission that is present there. The relations, and in particular the situation in Kosovo, I think have been a wake-up call in July. But I would say that all actors, including Pristina and Belgrade, and the international actors, have realized that we were all on a razor's edge during the past summer and into the early autumn. And everyone has taken a much more moderate position and followed the dialogue through, and the dialogue between the two will be pursued in the coming days. In fact, Robert Cooper, the EU facilitator, will be in the region in the coming days to move it to the next step. And hopefully the actors will find it in themselves to find a compromise on the particular issue of Kosovo's participation in regional meetings. I would also mention that the role of women in security is an extremely important part of this broader NATO integration framework, and the UN Security Council 1325 has spurred a number of countries in the region to develop national action plans, which also contribute to the strengthening of regional cooperation. I would just like to correct my colleague Dan Serwer. Serbia is not participating in Afghanistan in the ISAF mission. All other countries of the region are participating, although there was an offer under the Prime Minister of Zoran Živković for that participation that never materialized. I would like to end these brief remarks quoting a renowned social scientist, Albert Hirschman, who in a seminal book entitled Passions to Interests, I would say that if we were to summarize the region has been moving from ethno-nationalist passion to interest without losing passion for Euro-Atlantic integration. Thank you.
Mr. Vejvoda, thank you very much for your testimony. All three of you, thank you. Let me just begin the questioning. First, Dr. Serwer mentioned that Macedonia has done yeoman's work and really should be invited to join NATO. I wonder if our two distinguished witnesses here in Washington agree with that.
I think that it should definitely be invited, but I think that there is a very, I wanted to mention that there is a very large hurdle with its relationships with Greece, obviously, that I think after enlargement, the international community will lose some of its leverage over trying to bring about a workable solution. We should keep that in mind. I personally cannot block any country from joining NATO, and I think a NATO enlargement is certainly benefit to everyone. But I think that we should also consider what our abilities to effect change will be after enlargement is granted.
Okay.
I would like to add that here we see the negative results of keeping a country from moving forward, even in spite of the merits of its reforms. I would like to remind you that Macedonia was given candidate status to the European Union in 2005, and that NATO in Bucharest agreed that Macedonia had met all the requirements. The fact that it did not move forward into negotiations for accession to the European Union, for example, in 2006, or did not get membership, has unfortunately used certain populist politics that have not helped the democratic reform process. And thus, anything that can be done to encourage our Macedonian and Greek friends to find that difficult compromise, that difficult middle ground. And of course, we all know how difficult symbolic and identity politics are. They're probably the deepest issues, and names in particular. What's in a name, one would say, but we see how detrimental that has been to the region. So I would encourage a decision to move Macedonia forward, because it will help the what is at heart to all of us, and that is the further stability and peace in the region.
Ms. Gelazis, you indicated, and you just did it again in your statement, that perhaps after enlargement, after being accepted, the process of reform slows or comes to a halt. On the economic front, that has always been the case, at least when it regards to human rights, in my opinion. Even when China was accepted into WTO and we granted MFN, not only did human rights or any progress towards human rights cease, they went into a very serious reversal. And the same thing happened most recently with Vietnam, when the bilateral agreement was agreed to. That very day, there was a reversal, and Block 8406, which was patterned after Charter 77, the great human rights organization founded by Václav Havel and others, went into immediate reversal in Vietnam as soon as the economic benefit was gleaned. But my question is, does that also hold true with the dynamic responsibilities that are inherent in joining a military organization like NATO, where the military needs to increase its conformity, I would think, to doctrine and to command and control and all the other aspects that is required. Unlike in an economic situation and the human rights linkage, it would seem that the military component here, joining NATO, leads to more progress. And I'm wondering how our other colleagues or witnesses might feel about that. And I would ask you, if you could, in your answer, with Albania and Croatia having joined in 2009, did the rate of progress continue with them once they had achieved NATO membership? Dan?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that progress often slows. Nevertheless, I think it, as Ivan has suggested, to hold people artificially out of the alliance also causes retrograde political movements, which has certainly happened to some degree in Macedonia, but as I indicated, I don't think it's serious enough to continue to block them from NATO membership. In fact, quite to the contrary. I think getting them in now is really very important. Croatia is under enormous pressure to do an enormous array of reforms as part of its EU membership process. So I don't think it has slowed much since membership in NATO. Albania is a very difficult political environment, and I must say I've never quite understood what makes it quite as difficult as it is. It doesn't have the kind of ethnic differences that have made for problems in the other Balkans countries. But it is a fact that Albania has struggled to meet democratic norms even after membership in NATO. Mr. Chairman, I should apologize. I trust Ivan is correct that Serbia did not deploy in Afghanistan, and I apologize. I'm not sure how that error got into my text, but I'm sorry for it. Thank you.
Either of you like to respond?
Yeah, I'd like to add a few words on Albania. I think we must really acknowledge in answering this question that Albania had a much more difficult starting point than any other country in the post-communist world. This was, to coin a phrase, a totally totalitarian country. Under Enver Hoxha closed for decades, and simply the institutional basis from which they began was minus 100 compared to all other countries. Former Yugoslavia was very much plugged into the West, had open borders, people working in Europe, constant contacts, academic, institutional, was member of the IMF, World Bank, etc. And thus, I think what we're seeing today is in fact part of that negative legacy of the starting point. And there have been Herculean efforts on the part of Albanian Democrats to move forward, but simply without wanting to be deterministic or following Montesquieu and climate and geography, still I think we have, one has to have strategic patience, but also encourage Albanian colleagues and Democrats to overcome the differences that have created obstacles in actually further developing institutional stability. Croatia is simply a different environment, and they have had to address difficult issues, and in fact the EU is still monitoring them in this time up to the actual accession moment, which will be in July 2013, in particular on the issue of the judiciary.
Part of the reason for the question is the convergence of things like MFN did not lead to the reforms that we expected, but can we expect that an early or at least a timely acceptance into NATO could actually accelerate those reforms, particularly militarily?
I think it's important to look at the policy options before us, not simply as a switch between whether or not we give or don't grant NATO accession. I think there are many policy options that are available to us if we think creatively about the associations that we already have with these countries, if we think creatively about the different international institutions that are active on the ground in countries like Macedonia and Albania, and we think of ways that we can work with our partners in Europe to build programs that are parallel on the track towards NATO accession. I think that gives us more a leeway in terms of crafting a specific policy that's geared to the very unique issues that each of these countries confronts. So that's something I think we should keep in mind. Whether or not progress slows is, I think, dependent also on how we deal with these countries on a day-to-day basis and the relationships that we create for the long run.
I have some additional questions, but I understand that Chairman Turner needs to leave, so I'd like to yield to him.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and I want to again thank you for focusing on this issue and this area. The Balkans are. As we look to both the written testimony and the great participation in the testimony that we have here, have a number of complex issues that require a very, very thoughtful approach. And in that, I'd like to address part of that in my question. My concern is we look to what happened after the Dayton Peace Accords with this area and with Bosnia. I think as we look into the structure of the government in Bosnia, the tri-presidency, the constitution that's there, and I think we're all thankful that they have now been able to form a government after the period where I think you had indicated 14 months in your testimony that had been where people were concerned as to if the parties were going to be able to come together. We have Croatia and Serbia and perhaps even Montenegro developing economically and looking elsewhere with Bosnia at their backyard, but not really being a top priority for either Croatia, Serbia, or other neighbors for resolution. My concern is this: is that I think Bosnia-Herzegovina is getting neglected in its resolution. If we look to NATO as an incentive, or the EU as an incentive, we still might be locked in sort of a stasis with Bosnia. I believe that you referenced in your testimony that a belief that the Constitution was ungovernable. I believe that even beyond just using NATO as an incentive or a carrot or even a progressive to-do list to assess what the parties in the Balkans need to do to transition toward integration into NATO and Europe, that there needs to be some more active U.S. efforts to try to resolve what really are the collective disintegration of the Yugoslavia issues. I think each of the parties look almost to their neighbor and say, well, when Kosovo is resolved, we'll resolve the Republic of Srpska. When Macedonia and its name is resolved, then perhaps we'll resolve the issue of what we're going to do with other areas of conflict or controversy. So looking even beyond the issue of Chicago and recognizing in all your testimony you say Bosnia is not ready to move, what do we need to do? How does the United States need to be more active to ensure that NATO can be a realistic goal ultimately for Bosnia, recognizing from all of your testimony that it's clearly not there now? Maybe we begin with Ivan.
Thank you, Congressman Turner. To put it in a nutshell, I think Bosnia will move, but it will be the last and the slowest to move. And that's a positive statement. Again, within the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia has probably the most difficult legacy, and it is different than all the other former republics of Yugoslavia, in that it was a kind of mini tri-one country where Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks have, over the decades under the previous empires, had a complex arrangement of power shareholding, consociationalism. And Dayton was not, the Dayton Constitution of Bosnia was not plucked out of the air. It is based on that very complex history. And of course, that is what makes it very difficult to govern. But I think that the example that I mentioned of the government suddenly being formed when nobody really expected it after more than 14 months, or the other example that Bosnia was able to follow the roadmap to visa-free liberalization after Montenegro, Macedonia, and Serbia got it more than 2 years ago. Suddenly Bosnia realized that it was falling behind, and the politicians had no qualms about kicking their administrations into gear to do what those previous countries had done. This is not such a small example of this pulling effect that the region has on Bosnia. I think it's very important that Croatia and Serbia and Montenegro, as neighbors of Bosnia and Herzegovina, irrespective of what one may think, but in general, are trying to have a constructive approach in that they all repeat the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Could they do more? Yes, of course they could. And I think with the new government in Zagreb that has just been inducted and the good relations that they have with Serbia, I think more will be done after we come out of the Serbian elections. But the European Union definitely, as the slow-moving juggernaut, should also be doing more with the support of the United States. And I think that there's more than meets the eye. Let me say just one more thing. The trade and the mutual dependency on trade of each of these countries is much bigger than they thought. And these countries, in Bosnia in particular, realized this as the global economic crisis came on. They are completely dependent, and most of the trade, intra-regional trade, actually goes between the three of them. So without each other, they could not economically survive, even in these adverse circumstances.
I agree with Ivan that we should look to the successful examples in Bosnia for a clue to how to unlock the seemingly impossible political deadlock there. In visa liberalization and informing the government recently, we see that the politicians were motivated by totally rational motivators. They, in order to have a budget for this year, they needed to form a government before December 31st. So, politicians in the region, and especially in Bosnia, respond to the incentives that are put before them. So we should think about those incentives as we continue to target specific sectors for our reforms there. One thing I think we shouldn't, even though we want to see progress in the region, we should realize that NGOs on the ground, grassroots movements that are fully in support of EU and NATO enlargement, have been using NATO and EU criteria to to hold their representatives to account. So if the international community gives them a free pass, we're undermining the work that is being done to create democracy from the grassroots, and we should keep that in mind that it's a trade-off when we give progress to a country without having them actually fulfilled the criteria. We should feel a greater responsibility to the people on the ground in the NGO community, in the grassroots political development, and make sure that those interests are being met too, and not just in the interests of the political elite.
Might I add a word here?
Yes, please do.
I think the heart of the matter in Bosnia is constitutional reform. And I don't think there's going to be constitutional reform unless the European Union insists on it. The Americans have conducted initiative after initiative in this area, and frankly, we failed. But the EU has the leverage to succeed, and we should be working with them to make sure that they use that leverage. I would add that I do think that Serbia in particular could do more to be helpful inside Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think the fact of the matter is that Mr. Dodik is part of the problem inside Bosnia. He's taken a very nationalist tack in which he's really trying to dismantle the state institutions as much as he's permitted to do. It really is up to Belgrade to tell him that it's gone too far.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this very important hearing.
Thank you, Chairman Turner. Mr. Adderholt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on Chairman Smith's question a little bit earlier about the Albania and Croatia and their joining the NATO. And as a follow-up question, has the NATO membership in Albania and Croatia, has it influenced their subsequent political development?
I think that it was seen as evidence that the international community does want to embrace the Western Balkans, that the idea that the Western Balkans will be part of Euro-Atlantic institutions is not just a dream, not just sort of on paper, but that it really will happen. I think it was an important signal not only to the Croats and the Croatians and the Albanians, but also to the people of the rest of the region, that this sort of merit-based progress is open to all of them. And in that sense, that certainly helped. I think because of the historical legacy in Albania, progress was a bit more slow. And in Croatia, they were able to muster support or to make sure that created a momentum for adopting EU reforms as well. But there is certainly a positive impact that simply being a member can make. But because there aren't democratic processes that are involved with being in NATO, there is a sort of limited impact that actually being a NATO member can make on democratic reforms on a day-to-day basis. But the spirit of it, the spirit of openness, the spirit of membership is certainly an important factor.
Just as a follow-up, can Croatia and Albania have a role in moving other countries forward?
They should. I think that through the Adriatic Charter, there is an opportunity to help. I think Croatia has already taken a role in sharing documents with the EU and with NATO enlargement, helping its neighbors figure out the complex legal structures, and they ought to be encouraged, especially since they are in, to help show the path to their neighbors. This sort of spirit of cooperation was certainly alive with the Vilnius Group in previous enlargements to NATO, where part of the process of becoming a member state of NATO was showing that this region was able to cooperate with each other. And so it wouldn't be a burden. They wouldn't just be adding new members that didn't know how to cooperate. So that sort of a process in the Western Balkans would be very welcome. And I think there are current institutions that could be used more readily to achieve those goals.
I would concur with that opinion. Definitely, it was a very positive signal to the whole region again, repeating what I said at the beginning, the European and NATO enlargement truly go hand in hand, and NATO accession, again with the exception of Serbia, is seen as a very significant step in the direction of full completion of democratic reforms. I would add also that having the militaries and their intelligence services at the table of NATO is a very important stabilizing element, not only because it reinforces the mechanisms of democratic control of the military and of the intelligence and security services, but also because it imbues the hearts and minds of those officers who are participating of the ways in which a democratic political military organization such as NATO goes about its business, so that there's an osmosis between the international or rather NATO level and the domestic level. And I think this in itself is a stabilizing element for the domestic political arena. Croatia, both its previous and its recent current government have, as Nida has mentioned, been very vocal in saying that they will support all the integration processes of those countries south of them who have not yet joined these institutions.
Serwer. Oh, go ahead.
You done?
Oh, I was going to have him to
yeah.
give his.
Dr. Serwer?
I think it's.
We've lost your audio.
Unmute.
There you are. I would just add this, that none of the problems with the current members, recent members of NATO, have to do with the involvement of the military in politics or being outside civilian control. And I think this is very important to recognize that there are a whole category of problems that might have been imagined to exist, which do not exist for these new NATO members. And I think that's part of the osmosis process that Ivan referred to, that these guys are all learning what the role of the military is in the democratic society, and they are conforming to that norm. And I think that's a very, very important achievement.
Let me just follow up with, if I could, with just one more question. What impact should the 2011 decision of the International Court of Justice have on U.S. policy regarding Macedonia's NATO bid?
Well, very briefly, because we've, I think, discussed this, I think it's a very significant decision by this highest judicial institution of the United Nations, and also the convincing vote of the judges, 15-1, I think speaks to the seriousness of the way in which they adjudicated this case. Simply, Greece was in breach of the agreement from the early 1990s, and has shown that it has been, in political terms, detrimental to what I think we're all seeking here, namely the further stability and peace of this region that went through a conflict in the 1990s. And thus, any further delay, and this is for the policy of the United States and the European Union, any further delay would be additionally detrimental and could be negative to the kind of political dynamics that we have in the region and in the particular countries at hand. Of course, one recognizes the difficulties that Greece has. It is on the front pages of all the international media, and I think we can sympathize with the plight of the Greek people, but nonetheless leadership is about making difficult decisions, and this one has been around for close to 20 years. And I don't think that in what is, in effect, without disrespect, a micro-region, and we are all micro-countries, Macedonia 2 million, Serbia the biggest in the Western Balkans, 7.5 million, that we need to look at the bigger picture and how does one survive in the world, even at the best of stages, but now especially when there is a lack of foreign direct investments on which all of these countries depend to have their economies produce jobs. The levels of unemployment are very high throughout the region, And anything that could better the image, and in this case this would be a very significant signal to investors, let alone policy makers and governments, would be very positive, and thus hopefully a sign could be given that would hearten Macedonia and the region to move forward towards membership.
Any comments?
I think that the initial reaction to the ICJ decision from NATO was that it doesn't, I don't remember exactly the quote, but this doesn't mean that it would be automatic, Macedonia would automatically be granted accession to NATO. I think there have been many comments from meetings that I participated in that say that, where people have said that many European countries and the EU Commission have sort of been hiding behind Greece's blocking the progress of Macedonia for other reasons. That there are concerns about the democratic consolidation in Macedonia. There are concerns about the handling of the ethnic minorities and vulnerable persons. And I think with the ICJ decision, we may see some of these other concerns coming out as well. This is a good thing because then we can address those concerns head on. We can end this idea that there is simply only Greece is the only factor blocking Macedonia. I think there are other things that an NGO community in Macedonia is aware of, that human rights organizations have been tracking, that democracy promotion organizations have been looking at, that have to do with freedom of the media, that have to do with judiciary, that have to do with the corruption. And I think these are issues that need to be addressed. I think that for the United States government, this is the ICJ decision is an invitation for us to engage even more strongly with Greece to work on a solution, to make sure that this isn't seen as the only issue that's hampering progress for Macedonia.
Mr. Chairman, let me be blunt. If there is no change at all as a result of the ICJ decision, you're going to see bad things happening in Macedonia. It's a country in which both ethnic Macedonians and ethnic Albanians want to see progress towards NATO, in which they've both taken political risks for that. They're both going to turn inward to their own ethnic constituencies and towards more ethnic politics if nothing happens at Chicago. It would be a big mistake, it seems to me. We've already seen the negative impact of what happened at Bucharest. We shouldn't repeat the same mistake in Chicago. And I do believe that the United States has a strong role to play here in urging Athens and Skopje either to come to a solution on the name before Chicago, or to agree to proceed with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia as the name of the country for NATO purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Engel.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all three witnesses for excellent testimony, and I virtually agree with everything they've said. It's very, very important that we focus on this region. In my opening statement, I mentioned KFOR, the NATO Kosovo force, and I said that I am opposed to the further reduction of troops because there has been provocations and some violence in the northern part of Kosovo. And I even think, again, that as our country removes forces from Iraq and the rest of Europe, this would be a good time for the U.S. To shift by a moderate amount, a few battalions, to the U.S. contingent in Kosovo. The NATO peacekeeping mission, the KFOR, has had to respond to provocations and violence in North Mitrovica and in the northern part of Kosovo. I'm wondering if our witnesses could assess KFOR's response. I happen to believe that we cannot allow these things to fester and keep kicking the can down the road, because violence on both sides is just festering, and until we handle the problem, I just think we run the risk of more violence. I strongly believe in the territorial integrity of Kosovo. I know there are some in Belgrade that would like to partition Kosovo and have the north be part of Belgrade, of Serbia. But I don't think that that's something that you can do or should be doing in the Balkans. And I think that we need to very forcefully defend the territory of Kosovo and not allow these Serbian parallel institutions or other such things to happen, or we're going to continue, I fear, to see more violence as we did this past weekend. So I'm wondering if our panelists could tell us how they would assess KFOR's response so far with the difficulties in the north of Kosovo.
Did I understand that people are looking to me?
I was going to say, don't all jump at once.
I think it's quite clear, Ms. Engel, that KFOR is close, if not beyond the limits of its capabilities in handling the situation in the north right now. It appears that the situation south of the Ibar as well was not well handled over the weekend by the Kosovo Police Service. There are now investigations that will be launched of excessive use of force in that situation. People use excessive force when they're not well trained and when they're not well equipped and when they're not when they don't have adequate capability. And I think we are at the very limits of what KFOR can be reasonably expected to do. It should not be drawn down any further. It needs to stay, if not be strengthened a bit. And we need to work very hard with the European Union, as I know our diplomats are doing, to resolve the question of the North. I believe it can be resolved within the context of the Ahtisaari plan with any further clarifications of the Ahtisaari plan that are needed, codified into new implementation agreements. And I think that diplomatic effort has to be a strong and vigorous one. And I know that State Department and European Union agree with that. But until it's over, we have to keep KFOR at least at its present strength. Thanks.
In my testimony, I displayed a bit of disappointment that KFOR was needed and that the drawdown for KFOR was halted because of the violence that we experienced, that we witnessed in the last few months. I think I'm disappointed, and I think a lot of European member states of NATO and the EU are disappointed as well, because it seems to indicate a trade-off. If we have KFOR there, there's a trade-off to our perception of the country's readiness to participate or to build institutions that can deal with conflict in a nonviolent way. If the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo were going better, if it were more inclusive, or if there were institutions on the ground, judicial institutions on the ground that could handle these differences, we wouldn't need a military presence. And I think that's the disappointment that I feel. It's too bad that we still need a KFOR there, but hopefully with continued KFOR troops, with continued engagement with both Serbia and with Kosovo, we can see a day, not too far in the future when conflicts between ethnic groups can be resolved in other institutions.
Yeah, I can add that I think maintaining the level of KFOR presence at the current numbers, I think, is desirable. I think that the expected drawdown from 5,000 to 2,000 would have been possible had we not had the unwanted events that occurred in July. And I would say, again, looking at the longer term from 2000 onwards, that we have in fact progressed, and if I can put it in European historical terms, the fact that Pristina and Belgrade have sat down at a table, if I can say so in quotation marks, only 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, is great European speed when you compare it to the Northern Irelands or other places where it took 9 years after the Good Friday Agreement for a provisional government to be formed. And if you remember well, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness didn't even shake hands after 9 years. So I think that Albanians or Serbs are doing quite well here in these European terms. And I think what we need to do, and what the European Union is doing with the backing of the United States, is to facilitate that dialogue and to try and move to the margins those who are impatient on either side to see something that is undesirable. So I would say that the dialogue is extremely important, and that KFOR needs to be there to secure and see that this is moved forward. KFOR has played an incredibly important role to remind us of the unfortunate March 2004 events, where it defended the Serbs against attempts to expel them. It's important in protecting the monasteries there. But also, I would say, the fact that in the past 6 months, President Tadic has clearly indicated that partition is not a solution, that he and the Serbian government understand this, and that they are seeking a solution within what are the recognized boundaries of Kosovo, even though Serbia clearly does not recognize the independence of Kosovo, are heartening signals. His plan of 4 elements of such a solution that was positively remarked on by the British government just recently. The fact that the President Tadic has also talked to other leaders, again, is a sign of the political will, I would say, of both sides. And the fact that we have avoided major violence, not to say that there hasn't been violence, but that something that could have actually turned into something much bigger, is again a demonstration of restraint of both sides, and of KFOR itself, and of EULEX, and positive because I think there's been a realization that all the good work that has brought us to this point after all these years could have rolled back in one day. And I think that awareness, given the European context, given the fact, and I would like to remind us that NATO in Bosnia, that came in with thousands of troops, and in Kosovo KFOR, compared to an Iraq or an Afghanistan, has suffered next to no casualties or minimal. And I would say this mere fact of the positive acceptance of an interposition force that was S4 in Bosnia, or EU4 now in Bosnia, or KFOR, is an indication that these people and these societies want to move forward. So KFOR, I think, is an integral element of that facilitation to move forward.
Well, thank you. I want to add that I think the sooner that the powers that be in Belgrade understand that partition is not a possibility, the sooner that we'll have peace. Ultimately, if all countries are in the EU, borders are not that significant, and I hope that Mr. Tadic, many of us had high hopes for him when he first came in, and we've been disappointed that he hasn't. I realize it's a difficult position, but that I think that in my estimation, the Serbian politicians ought to be talking truth to their people. They do them a disservice by fudging the issue of Kosovo. I think Kosovo is here to stay, and many countries are recognizing them. And in fact, I just wanted to also mention that I've helped to secure the release of James Berisha, who has been flying around in a plane to different countries to get them to recognize Kosovo. He was held in prison in Eritrea, and we've just gotten his release. So I just hope that can be done. I wanted to ask a Macedonia question, because I wanted to ask our panelists the assessment of the degree of which the Ohrid Agreement which ended the 2001 conflict in Macedonia, is being implemented. In your opinion, has ethnic Albanians been integrated adequately into the government, military, and police? Does this also benefit the integration of the Roma and other minorities, or make their situation more challenging? Are ethnic divisions, Ms. Gelazis, you referred to that, a reason to worry about Macedonia's future development? Do we think a Macedonian accession to NATO might help some progress in this regard?
I'd like to answer by tying this together with the visa liberalization reform that the EU instituted. In a recent report, the Commission noted that there were some irregularities in the visas that were given to, or the use of the visas from people coming from Macedonia and from Serbia, and it was decided by the Commission that the proper response would be to use this opportunity to make sure that vulnerable people in those countries are adequately protected, that they are integrated into their society. So that indicates to me that they are not quite meeting the standard that the EU would like to have. That people who are in vulnerable groups in that region in Macedonia feel compelled to seek redress from the outside of the country, and I think that's a problem. The European Union and the NATO countries have had a lot of experience with that, and none of the European countries that are in the EU or NATO have completely homogeneous populations. That's the place to look for answers. That's the place to look for solutions that can accommodate minorities living in Macedonia. And I think that through the integration process, the Ohrid agreement will be implemented over time. But I think we can't ignore some problems that are coming up.
I think as someone mentioned earlier, the very difficult decisions of the leaderships of the two communities in Macedonia, ethnic Macedonians and Albanians, after the 2001 conflict were extremely important as a signaling to a willingness to not only continue to live together but to integrate more firmly. Obviously easier said than done. And over the years, I think there's been a significant accomplishments, especially in the fact that coalition governments since then have always had parties of both the majority and the minority ethnic group, and that places in the administration have been fulfilled by ethnic Albanians. Surely more could have been done, but again, this is a process, and one needs to give time, so this is fully accomplished. Again, here, the fact that Macedonia didn't begin negotiations with the European Union, didn't get membership, hasn't been helpful to the implementation of that agreement. On the Roma, I think it's a much broader issue. The Roma are probably the most downtrodden minority throughout Europe. This is also the case in countries who are members of the European Union further north, whether we're talking about the Czech Republic, Slovakia, I mean Serbia. All of these countries have Roma minorities where much needs to be done. Obviously, in dire economic straits, they're the ones who then suffer most because there's least possibilities for a variety of social programs and inclusion. But again, I think each of these countries, and thus including Macedonia, are not only aware but realize that the European Union and the US are looking very carefully at exactly the treatment of that minority which is suffering the most. And that's why it's important that we always remember and remind ourselves, as you did, Congressman Engel, of the Roma.
Mr. Serwer, Dr. Serwer.
Mr. Chairman, I was in Macedonia last summer, and I found an odd situation with respect to the Ohrid Agreement. I don't think it would be correct to say that it has been implemented in every one of its details. There are shortcomings, and those shortcomings affect the Albanian community a little bit more obviously than the Macedonian community. Nevertheless, The Albanian community has enormous enthusiasm for the Ohrid Agreement, and the Macedonian community has significantly less enthusiasm for it. They see it as taking something away from them. That kind of negative nationalist reaction would be greatly amplified if Macedonia fails to make real progress towards NATO this year. The Macedonians will feel a profound sense of disappointment, and we've seen in the past how they react to that. And then the ethnic Albanians react to the profound sense of disappointment of the Macedonians by augmenting their ethnic nationalism. We could head down a very negative spiral here. The Ohrid Agreement has been a terrific step forward for Macedonia. It's not 100% implemented, but it points in the right direction, and that's a direction we should keep Macedonia moving in.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have one last question. It involves Albania. And I thought Mr. Vejvoda hit the nail on the head when he said that Albania had the longest way to go, given their history of 50 years of oppression under the Hoxha regime. I was a big supporter of Albania being in NATO, and I'm wondering if our panelists can comment on, do you think that Albania's being in NATO, their NATO membership, helped limit the political difficulties that we saw there?
Absolutely. I think Dan Serwer mentioned that earlier, that we sometimes fail to ask the if question. What if Albania had not been a member of NATO? And I agree with him that probably we would have seen more adverse dynamics politically in Albania. The fact that it came within the NATO framework was extremely important to limit undesirable political developments, and the fact that the military of Albania are part of NATO and their security services as well has been a positive limiting factor to that possible negative dynamics that sometimes politicians and political parties are prone to when they are confronted with difficult economic situations such as this one.
I agree that NATO, being in NATO, has a positive impact. Clearly, if NATO only accepts democracies and Albania is in NATO, then it has to be a democracy. If the opposition in Albania, if NGOs are criticizing the government for being undemocratic, for not holding open and fair elections, the Albanian government is forced to prove its democratic credentials, and in that sense, it is helpful that it has to have that label. I think it also provides an opportunity for NATO, other member states within NATO, to ask those questions to the Albanian leadership as well. So being part of a community can have that positive impact, if as long as we all take advantage of it.
Dr. Serwer?
I have nothing to add at this point.
Okay, I just thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that my opinion is that things are moving in the right direction in Albania, and as a member of NATO, I think that's been a very positive effect on the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. Let me just ask a few final questions. First, again, following that same line of reasoning that the NATO framework limits potentially negative outcomes and a negative future, as you just pointed out with Albania. What is the way forward for Bosnia? I'm very concerned. I've been working the Bosnia issue, if you will, for most of my time in Congress, especially during the war there. Went there many times, held hearings. We heard from people, including the man that did the translation when Mladic and the Dutch peacekeepers met. He was there. He lost his entire family. For this commission, the Balkans has been a very serious and almost a prime concern for years. And I am concerned that an opportunity could evaporate or at least diminish with regards to Bosnia. 2006, the Partnership for Peace was offered. 2010 of April, NATO invited Bosnia to join the Membership Action Plan, and we know that the one hindrance, according to Secretary General Rasmussen, is the issue of the military assets, and maybe you could offer some insights as to how that might be furthered, especially, and whether or not Republic of Srpska and all the different entities are really on the same page with regards to joining NATO, publicly as well as, more importantly, privately. Do they really want this all? And so a way forward, if you could, all of you could speak to that.
Well, I had a chance, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
to speak to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Ms. Ana Trišić-Babić, who is also the chairman or chairperson of their National Coordination NATO Council, recently at a conference in Berlin in December, and she is from Republika Srpska. She reassured me about the overall intention of the country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and of the two entities, and thus of Republika Srpska, to move forward, because it was in the interest, along the lines that we have just been mentioning on Albania and Macedonia, that this would be a factor of stabilization overall of the polity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Also, when the early mentions of NATO membership was there, it was endorsed also by Milorad Dodik from Republika Srpska. We know that in some subsequent declarations he has, made his position more vague, but I go by someone from his political environment, Ms. Trišić, when she says this a month ago. And I know that there's a possibility that she remain the Deputy Foreign Minister, and if that's anything to go by, I think we will see a development on this outstanding condition of the military property. Now, again, it's easy for us to say we'll see how the new government at the central level will go about this, but if that visa process is anything to go by, the formation of this government, as Nida rightly alluded to, based on rational decision-making in the interests of those politicians who are incumbents and have been elected. Thus, possibly, this positive move towards the beginning of implementation of a membership action plan can help them for their own particular political interests, let alone the public good, which would benefit from that.
Thank you.
I agree with Ivan. I would also add that the international community's work in Bosnia has, I hope, slowly cornering the leaders of this nation to sort of do the right thing and adopt institutions that are truly democratic, that will truly, fit into Euro-Atlantic structures. For instance, the European Court of Human Rights has had the ruling on the Sejdić-Finci case, which deems that the Constitution is in fact undemocratic, doesn't follow human rights to the European standard, and those that decision, the Venice Commission assessment of the Constitution and other chapters of the Constitution, the EU accession process, the NATO accession process, all of these institutions and actors, and including the United States, ought to sort of continue to corner the leaders of this country, show where their interests are in line with making these, adopting these changes. And then engaging with civil society is an important factor as well, because I think you'll get much more support for international efforts towards NATO accession, to creating a government that can respond to the interest of the citizens, and that should be our partner in this challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Serwer.
Mr. Chairman, I'm more pessimistic than my colleagues are. I think that Milorad Dodik has made very clear his intention not to allow the government in Sarajevo to have the kind of powers and authority that are required of a NATO and EU member. He's talked about the possibility of independence. He's made it absolutely clear that the courts of Republika Srpska should not be in any way beholden to the courts of the country as a whole. He's really put forward a program which is one of maximum autonomy, and that program is not consistent with NATO and EU membership. I think until we solve that problem, and that problem has to be solved, it seems to me, in revisions to the Constitution, until we solve the basic political framework, I'm afraid that Bosnia is going to lag farther and farther behind everybody else. Solving it is going to require a joint EU-US effort, with the EU ready to use serious leverage in order to get what we need to get for EU and NATO membership. Thank you.
Sir, are we doing that now, the U.S. and the European Union? Are we using any serious leverage vis-a-vis Bosnia?
The short answer is no. I don't think we're using the kind of leverage that is needed to get real results, and that's a result of a very different attitude in Europe towards the use of leverage than there is in the United States. You know, it's very hard to borrow somebody else's leverage, but that's what's really needed here.
Let me ask just a couple of final questions. In 2001, I asked the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense Inspector General, his name was Joseph Schmitz at the time, to undertake a global assessment of the United States military's complicity in human trafficking. We had gotten reports, particularly out of South Korea, of U.S. service members abusing Russian, Moldovan, Philippine, and other women who were at brothels, as well as indigenous South Koreans. And this situation in the Balkans had manifested itself repeatedly. UN peacekeepers, UNMEC, we held hearings. I chaired hearings where we talked about DynCorp and some of its police who were complicit in trafficking. Make a long story short, the report that the IG put together was devastating. In response, George Bush issued a zero-tolerance policy. The next year, I traveled to first to Athens and then to Brussels and met with NATO leaders, top command leadership, and pushed a zero-tolerance policy. Most were very open. One particular admiral said, "What will my sailors do when they offload in Athens and want a good time?" And it was not only was that very, I think, foolish of him to say that, I had just been in 2 trafficking safe houses in Athens and had met a number of women who had been rescued, and I invited him in very strong terms to go visit those shelters and see what it is that these individuals were doing to these women and exploiting them. Make a long story short, as we all know, NATO does have a zero-tolerance policy, just like the United Nations. But I'm wondering, you know, zero tolerance sounds good, looks good in a pad. What does it mean in actual training? What does it mean in terms of integration into NATO? And my question to all 3 of you, are the countries and their militaries being, is there an effort being made to comport and conform with a very high standard of zero tolerance for the exploitation, particularly of women and children, by way of human trafficking? Is that actually happening with this process?
I think that, again, here NATO and the EU have very strict requirements for the visa liberalization roadmap. This was one of the requirements, that a number of action plans not only be voted in, but that there was implementation. This is concurrent, I would say, within the larger framework of fighting organized crime. And again, without painting a rosy picture, the level of coordination between, for example, the countries of the region and their police forces, and, for example, the DEA here on drug abuse, or the British Serious Organized Crime Unit, has produced a number of results over the past 2 years, with important capture not only of drugs but also of the criminals who are engaged in this. And this, of course, is applied also to human trafficking and to women in particular. And I know, and this is simply by following the news from the region, that every now and then you do read about arrests of people who have been engaged in all of these countries. And I think it's obvious to say, but needs to be repeated, this can only be tackled at a trans-border regional level with international institutions involved, whichever they are in their. This is not something that a country by itself, a Montenegro or a Serbia or a Kosovo, can deal with itself.
Thank you.
I commend you for your efforts on this very important issue. I think that one of the it's one thing to have a country adopt a resolution, to have a military add to its organization issues that protect vulnerable people. But it's a very different thing that we make sure that people implement these and that these rules are being used. To that extent, in that regard, we need to make sure that there is adequate judicial reform, that institutions in these countries offer victims remedies when these rules get violated, which inevitably they do. That's and in that sense, we should continue our focus on EU accession, which is hoping to push the negotiations on judicial reform up in all of the future invitations for EU accession, so that there's a longer time span to view and witness and to experience what the judiciary is doing in each of these member states. I think that's a vital element of any human rights policy, to make sure that the institutions that provide remedies for victims are there and are used well.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you asked a very specific question whether zero tolerance is being implemented adequately in these countries, and I confess that I don't know the answer to that question. So your asking it will prompt me to be asking it, and I think that's a good thing, and I hope you continue asking it. I thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to your response to it as soon as you get some information, because it seems to me it's a matter of prioritization. You know, I mean, I have tried and failed. As a matter of fact, even when we did the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we had a section that would have established an assistant secretary level person at the Department of Defense to work trafficking and have a real core of people to work military to military, as well as within our own military, to try to mitigate and hopefully end this barbaric activity known as human trafficking, and we failed. I have a bill pending right now that would do it again, because it seems to me military to military, and the generals and the colonels and everybody else, the whole chain of command, will be much more apt to listen when those best practices are shared among themselves, rather than a lawmaker or a politician bringing it. And again, I'll never forget that meeting at NATO headquarters when, in a very dismissive tone, some of the female officers were absolutely angered by this man saying this. I was amazed that he had the imprudence to say what he was thinking, but he did. But it showed a level of contempt for the sacredness of those women's lives, that they were just seen as people that could be exploited by his sailors. So let me just, and this would be to you, my friend, and final question, and then anything else you would like any of you add as we go to closure. Cheruvia, the great journalist who sat right where both of you sit in the 1990s and testified, and in the opening days of the bombing campaign by the U.S. and by NATO, he was gunned down by Milosevic's henchmen. At least we believe that. And I know you follow Serbia very, very closely. Has anybody been brought forward to trial? I know not to trial yet, but with regards to his assassination?
Thank you for asking that question, Mr. Chairman. I had the honor of knowing Mr. Slavko Cheruvia very well, and in fact, I was then working for the Open Society Institute when he went and embarked on the independent newspaper, and we supported him financially at that moment. I was in Belgrade also during the bombing, not a pleasant moment to be there with my family, and I was there and went to the scene where he was assassinated, so it's a very tragic story. The unfortunate answer to your question is that no one has been brought to justice, although we practically know the story inside out. It has been leaked from the police, from security sources, of who the possible assassins were. It is alleged with great certainty that this was ordered from the tops of the regime by Milosevic and his wife as a kind of revenge for the fact that Churuvia, who was close to them, then departed from them and embarked on a more liberal democratic approach to his newspaper. I'm sorry to say that I do not understand why this is the case if everything is more or less known, and the former partner of Mr. Churuvia, who lives in Belgrade today, has been alerted to these facts. I'm at a loss to answer this question, and I'll be as happy as you to find out when apparently the exact assassin has himself been assassinated, but it is very important that this get closure through due process in a trial in Belgrade.
I appreciate that so very much. Would any of you like to conclude or make any final comments?
I would just like to add an obvious addition to your former question, and that is that the role of civil society, NGOs, women's organizations, is extremely important in this combating of human trafficking, women and children in particular. And I know from a number of examples in the countries of the region that their cooperation with the police has been improving over the past 10 years because, again, the coordination there is very important for sources of information, for tracking individual women and others as a way to reach those who are actually organizing this despicable activity.
Well said.
Mr. Chairman, maybe I can just add, since I sat at that table with Slavko Churuvia at the time of that testimony, maybe I can just add that I think the failure to resolve that particular case is part of a broader failure of institutional reform in the secret services in Serbia. I think the reform has progressed much more in the military than it has in some of the shadowier services. And I'm here in Belgrade today for a conference on dealing with the past, and I will raise that question about Churuvia at that conference and try to press the issue. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And again, as on the other question, if you find anything, please let us know, because this commission, we've had 2 witnesses over the years killed after testimony, one from Northern Ireland and Belgrade. And, you know, I know all of us, staff and members, feel a great sense of concern whether or not we actually put a further spotlight on that individual that led to their killing. So we too want closure, and for the person or persons who have committed these crimes to be held to account. So thank you so much, all of you, for your exemplary work on behalf of human rights and democracy and the rule of law, and for sharing those insights with us today. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.